Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the latest album from Spunkshine, The Most Distant Machine. Alright, it's time to talk about Spunkshine again. David Asman, electronic artist who's somehow formed an identity out of a lack thereof. His stuff is very odd, and not in a traditional way that sticks out to you as odd right from the get-go. I mean, you hear it first and you think, this isn't really that weird, is it? But then you listen more and start to think about it, and the more you think about it, the more you realize, wait a second. What? His style seems to be a hodgepodge of everything. You could get something driving and intense, or chill and laid back, something electronic or acoustic, something serious or unserious. There's really no rhyme or reason to any of it, and there's really no way to expect anything out of him besides a certain palette of sounds and synth settings that he likes to use a lot. That being said, I will also unfortunately have to admit I don't think he's the most consistent artist quality-wise either. While I think the majority of his albums are at least good, I'd say really only two of them were actually great. And those would be And Yet It Moves and Huge Humans. Yes, I have CDs of them, and good luck actually getting CDs of this guy yourself. These were pretty hard to find. And I'll have to admit as well that as much as I've enjoyed his stuff, he's never really been on in heavy rotation, which is honestly probably just my own fault. I mean, my opinions might change with more repeat listens. I mean, I do happen to be a reviewer and college student who doesn't have a lot of spare time really to put him in rotation, but I really haven't had the time where I felt like I was in the mood for some Spunkshine, or for that matter, really set aside the time to figure out what that mood might even be. He's really the kind of artist that I need to sit up and pay attention to really get a more visceral reaction out of his stuff. Wallpaper music from far away, but actually quite interesting when you look at it more closely. But if there is one thing that prevents me from giving up on him, besides the fact that he's basically a completely unknown artist, and I believe he deserves better, is that no one, and I mean no one, comes up with song and album titles like this guy. Like, this guy's first album was called Distorting the Hertzian Wave. How can something like that not be intriguing? With a presentation as uniquely insane as his, there's still always going to be that part of me that says, you really ought to listen to some more Spunkshine, man. I should probably do a discography review of this guy at some point. I know no one's really going to watch it, but it would be great to have my thoughts down on paper so I can really soak it all in. Now, some people may of course remember last year when I reviewed his previous album, The Weight of the Ship. I thought it was pretty good overall, though admittedly it had a handful of kind of lackluster moments, and I have not listened to it since making the video. I'll link that review in the description anyway, and you can check it out if you want the In Brief segment as well. I decided to skip that segment this time because I got a pretty busy schedule, and this is his 10th album to date. No shortage of stuff to check out with this guy. Already mentioned the two big ones to check out, and it was because of my review of him last year that he was very nice to me and emailed me a free download to this latest album. I figured it was only fair that I reviewed this one as well. So, how does this latest Spunkshine effort, The Most Distant Machine, fare? Well, I think we can now raise the count of great Spunkshine albums from 2 to 3 now. I enjoyed the hell out of Most Distant Machine. While admittedly it's far from being anything super new or out of the ordinary for Spunkshine, he basically pulled from the exact same palette of sounds that he utilized in his last album, The Weight of the Ship, and you can hear bits and pieces of in various other old albums of his. But I don't know what it was about this particular album that really clicked with me, honestly, though I think I'm starting to figure out the best sort of conditions that make Spunkshine's music work the best for me. As I have figured out, though, his music does often have a more nocturnal sort of atmosphere, often pretty moody, and not precisely as quirky and silly as his name would have you believe. I mean, there's a wide variety of instrumental elements that go into his music and make him pretty weird, but I think he can be really good if I happen to be in the right mood for it. And I think this most recent album not only showed him to be a bit more focused than usual, seemed to coalesce together pretty well, but I think this one also had a stronger attention to detail in some areas that I didn't get as much out of the last album, and it was, overall, a lot more immediate listen than the usual from him. The first 4 tracks on this thing are all excellent and really kick us off on a good note. Like the first track, the Thousandth Antenna, starts us off on a suitably creepy and atmospheric note, with a slow synth sequence accented by strings and piano. Sounds like it could soundtrack a documentary about urban legends or something. For me, though, probably the highlight of this whole album is track 2, Shielded Realism, parentheses, now featuring Tingling Sureness. Ludicrous song titles is on point as always. As people know, I am a sucker for vibraphones, and there's plenty of those to be found on this particular track, as well as other instrumental touches that I nearly always enjoy, again, pianos and strings, and some great spacey ambient pads and muffled beats. But in addition to that, I really like how oddly structured this track is, coming to a dead stop about 3 minutes in with a slow-motion vocal sample and toning. From now on, I'm gonna keep a pretty close watch on these guys. And it sounds like it changes into almost a completely different track entirely, with really cool flanging synths, warm pianos and choirs to help define the atmosphere. This was seriously a stunning beginning to this album. 2 tracks in and I was absolutely hooked. And Spunkshine almost never pulls that off, honestly. There's a bit of a cinematic vibe he utilizes throughout this album that is really executed spot on, especially the melancholy and emotional but jazzy tones of The Realization of Endless Hugeness, as well as the title track on here, which has a bit of a film noir thing going for it. And of course, there's just 2 straight ambient tracks on here, one of which penetrating the heliopause boundary. That closes out the album on a haunting and ominous note. The other ambient piece on here, Vast and Indifferent, I'm unfortunately rather indifferent towards. But yeah, while this track is cool when I examine it up close, has some nice progression if you pay close enough attention, just by itself, it comes off as a rather unengaging track. Not a skippable one, it's not bad at all, it's just okay and falls into the background easily. But of course, it wouldn't be Spunkshine if we didn't have a couple of tracks that lean towards the lighthearted side of things. Well, admittedly, that's only relatively speaking. The more up-tempo tracks do still have a moody quality to them. My favorite of those is undoubtedly the first, Negotiating the Outcome. This track goes all over the place, starting out with acoustic guitars and a buzzing bass synth, both of which Spunkshine is no stranger to. Though later on we start hearing some weirdly implemented trap percussion juxtaposed with all these horns. Like it's just there as a quick build-up before yet another diversion. So that one definitely stood out to me the most. Weaponized Narratives is similarly odd, with a fairly fast and foot-tapping beat kind of going up against these huge piano chords, though there's not really any huge out-of-left-field twists like on Negotiating the Outcome. But both some good fun tracks there. And also the penultimate track on here, Protecting the Fourth Wall, was a track that kind of compromises the moody and lighthearted sides of this album quite nicely. It does have a very suspenseful air to it and a lot of heavy-handed synth bass all over it. And like many other Spunkshine tracks, both here and in the past, it has plenty of cool progression to keep me interested. That being said, there are some weaker moments here too. We Need You Urgently was unfortunately not as urgent sounding as the title would lead you to believe. This track also has one drum loop in common with one of my own tracks, unfortunately. And it was actually one of my later ones, thankfully. My track, Can't Just Do This Without You, uses the same snare loop as We Need You Urgently by Spunkshine. And obviously this was a coincidence, but it was something that bothered me while I was listening to, because I literally just figured out which track of mine had the loop in common while recording the video. Before that, it was just some sense of deja vu that I couldn't put my finger on. I knew he used a loop that I used, but I have a pretty huge discography, so I didn't really want to actually go through everything and figure out which track it was. But I'll admit I have no idea how this is going to affect future listens. I imagine now that I actually have figured out which track he ripped me off on, even though he didn't actually rip me off. Not that I actually figured out which track of mine has the loop in common with Spunkshine. I think it's going to be less bothersome. I am at least glad the track in question was much later than it was by the time I gave up GarageBand entirely, so I'm at least glad he has higher standards and loops by this point. It's obviously not something he could avoid, but I had to point it out. Alright, so anyway, after that you got a couple of tracks that run together a bit but do have their interesting moments. Like, Enlarging the Center has a chord progression throughout most of it that sounds kind of like Chopsticks in reverse or something. In the Light of This Event has some haunting vocal samples placed at various intervals, and 16.9995 kilometers per second, or KPS as it is abbreviated. Could honestly stand for anything really, Kentucky Postal Service if you want. But this track is very easily distinctive due to its synth pads in the beginning that pop in and out at regular intervals. But the trouble with these last couple of tracks is that they have fairly similar grooves for the most part, and the latter track gives up on that element that made it more distinctive from the others like halfway through. And the last Barn I Burned suffers from a similar problem. While it jumps from sound to sound quite a lot, nothing seems to really stick out to me. For the record, I do think all of the above tracks are good and have been growing on me, all of them, but they are among the weaker parts of this album, and I'll admit I do not come out of this album at the end as captivated as I am when I come in at the beginning. But overall on this thing, I mean, obviously it's not perfect, it's not precisely doing anything that is super new or out of Spunkshine's comfort zone, and utilizes a lot of the same sounds and elements that he does in basically all of his albums, but this album clicked with me in a way that his other albums haven't. I've discovered, weirdly enough, Spunkshine's music is best enjoyed when you take it seriously and just let the mood and atmosphere do the work rather than particular details and looking for weirdness and just letting him surprise you when he does surprise you. And it took an album like this that executed that mood and atmosphere particularly well for me to fully realize this. This album is spot on in the atmosphere department, and while undoubtedly better in some areas than others, overall I enjoyed this album a lot, more than I expected to. It's one of my favorites from this guy to date, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. And checking this guy out in general. I need to listen to him more now. So on The Most Distant Machine, I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10. But of course this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.